Hi, it's Kirby Summers. Today is January the 10th. It is Friday. Thank God it's Friday. Well, at least for some of you, I tend to have 7-day work weeks. So for me, it's just another day. As promised, this is part two of the series that I am hoping to put here on this platform regarding the three-letter agency as it pertains to their initial involvement in the music industry, their ongoing involvement in the music industry, because as I explained to you in part one, which is really just the upload that I is in my list of, I think, 2 days ago. I want to take you step by step because what we're seeing in, let's say, the Sean, Diddy, Puffy, Combs love, and by the way, when he has changed his name, it's really a move taken straight out of the three-letter agency playbook. And I'm going to right now give you an example. So Frank Olson, who many of you may have heard was a biological warfare scientist employed by the three-letter agency, and who found himself flying out of the Hotel Statler in, let's say, on November 28th, 1953. Um, his family did not believe he would have jumped. However, it was discovered that he attended a meeting in Maryland where he was dosed with LSD by his very friendly colleague, Sidney Gottlieb, who was at the time the head of the three-letter agency's MK Ultra program. My point being that the Hotel Statler then transformed and became the Pennsylvania Hotel. And frankly, it then became something else. It was finally demolished in 2023, meaning last year, and it is now going to be replaced by something else entirely called 15 Penn Plaza, which is scheduled to be a 68-story tower. So that Sean Combs' name changes have been in keeping with the three-letter agency. Now, before I get started, I want to thank several people for contributing to my now new and exciting ability to have super thanks. So because I don't do live podcasts, I don't do streaming, I don't know how, I'm going to teach myself. I am allowed to accept super thanks either on this platform, which by the way, does keep 40%, with the intermediary financial institution maintaining another 9 or 10. And so the content creator like myself keeps about 50. Whereas if somebody goes to my website and does a one-time or a recurring contribution to my work, then I get to keep about 90%. So I want to thank Madeline D, Celine S, Brandon M, J.T., Alan R. And those of you who take the time to like and comment, I appreciate it because one of you very uh very you were very astute, let me just say, because what you wrote, and I forget what your handle is, and I probably will mention you in one of my podcasts. You said, wow, your information must be great because you're so incredibly shadow, Banned. And I agree, I am incredibly shadow, Banned. And frankly, there is something that you guys can do to help me. You can share my podcasts, share them with many people, with as many as you can. That way, you lend a hand to me and you lend a hand to people actually understanding what all of this is about, because it's really, while every now and then one of the bottom layer people like the Epi person and the Sean Combs person is, let's say, kicked out of the group, they're replaced. The people who come out and say, oh, this is the destruction of, or this is the end of. No, this is not the end or the destruction of, because nobody is talking about the major levels that are the puppeteers and are actually the people really in charge of the entertainment industry, not just the music industry, but the entertainment industry. So I believe in my last podcast, I said that William Paley, who was born on September 28th, 1901, and who lived until October 26, 1990, was in fact one of the founding members of the three-letter agency. And that while I did not go into his life, I am going to go into it right now because he too is the product of, oh man, so much is unsaid by all of these talking heads that we have, not just in mainstream media, but all of the talking heads who have their own channels on, let's say, YouTube or somewhere else. So prohibition was also responsible for the family wealth of William Paley, who, as I said, was one of the founders of the three-letter agency and who began CBS. And before I get started with the Clive Davis portion of, maybe I'll include it in this podcast, depending on the time, I'm going to go into how the period of prohibition, and in prohibition, we only know about a couple of names, including the Kennedy name, right? We know about these names. However, we don't know necessarily about the Paley name as it connects to CBS, which was one of the three initial television stations in the United States, all of whom had connections to the three-letter agency, nor do we have any knowledge of this family having acquired its wealth through prohibition. But you are going to learn about it here, perhaps for the first time. So his father is a man who doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. His name is Samuel Paley, and of course he was born poor. They were Jewish. It was a Jewish family. He was an immigrant from the Ukraine, and he, quote, ran a cigar company. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes, even as I'm trying to explain this to everyone, it's still shocking to me that no one has bothered to go into nooks and crannies. Now, I like to go into nooks and crannies. So Samuel Paley began what is known as La Palina Cigars. And of course, he was an immigrant. He came to the United States with no money, just like Wexy's family, right? And somehow these people managed to become super millionaires, super billionaires. They marry society hostesses, so on and so forth. So then, once he arrived in the United States, he settled in Chicago, in Illinois, of course, Chicago, where Al Capone was, right? Basically the home of the mob and the mobsters. So he settles in Chicago, Illinois. And frankly, I don't know how many of you have read my series, Deconstructing Wexner, on my Substack, but Wexy had his beginnings also in Chicago, Illinois, before his family decided to, let's just go over to Ohio. So, if you are aware of Chicago, Illinois, as it pertains to the Wexy family, and by the way, I also include in my series that a Wexy relative was, in fact, arrested multiple times, put in jail. So we have at least that. So Samuel found work um, in a cigar factory. And basically, he was the kind of person who was told to read newspapers and stories to the cigar rollers in the factory. And then he rose up and he was became a roller and then he became a blender. By 1980, I'm sorry, by 1896, he opened up his own store called Congress Cigar Company, and he also produced a brand for his new company called La Palina, and he named this after his wife Goldie Drell Paley. In 1910, the company moved to Philadelphia, another sort of like mob infested and intel infested town, let's say. And also our founding fathers, right? Philadelphia. The story of our founding fathers and the story of, let's say, these men who made their money as a result of doing things that were not legal for the rest of the world, but were legal for them, are pretty similar. Sometimes I feel that people think the founding fathers had no skeletons. They had the most skeletons of all, and they are interweaved and connected to the group of men who we study. And today we're studying William Paley, Samuel, his father, how they made their money and how they created CBS, where Clive Davis would go on to operate and, let's say, discover people like Janis Joplin, who was unalived. And I have spoken about the unaliving of Janis Joplin, I believe, either here or on my Patreon. So later, when William came of age, he was made vice president of the family cigar business. However, prohibition came around, and perhaps never explored was that prohibition also meant that the cigar industry tanked. Um, so prohibition basically began from 1920. It lasted a whole 13 years until 1933. And the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution banned the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors, including beer, wine, and spirits. And this was a significant time in history where the cigars were being basically introduced into the United States, where they were being used more frequently. And so that the cigar industry was also heavily affected by the ban on alcohol. The cigar industry had been really basically hand in hand reliant with the bars, with the saloons that prohibition did away with. So once prohibition came around, the demand for cigars decreased significantly. And so what does the people that were caught in the crosshairs of prohibition do? They did it in ways that were not legal, as in the Paley family. However, you will not find even one article about this. You will hear about it from me because I have a fascination with going into really nooks and crannies of history and things that are clearly unknown. Um, Paley, William Paley, Bill Paley, as he was more commonly referred to, uh, when he was working in the cigar industry, he decided to open a radio station. From that one radio station, he then opened five more. And initially, the radio station was called the La Palina Hour, basically using the name of his father's company. And again, it was in Philadelphia. It was supposed to be sponsoring a small radio show, but the sponsorship led to growth with the brand. And he went ahead and he realized that the radio reached a lot of people, and he purchased five more radio stations in Philadelphia, which became the beginning of the Columbia Broadcasting System that we know as CBS. In 1926, his father, Samuel, retired, and he took over. However, he's now entrenched in the broadcasting field. And he goes on to not only be a founding member of the three-letter agency, but he does basically begin CBS. Now, as I said in the previous podcast, they had a record division. Remember, the radio is where people used to listen to music at the time. So not only was it the advent of television, but it was also the beginning of the record industry, the music industry as we know it today. One of the people that was hired to work in the company was Clive Davis's mentor. Yeah, everybody has a mentor. And at one time, 92-year-old Clive Davis was somebody's protege with all of what that implies. Okay, so when I say protege, we have heard that Epi was Wexy's protege, but Clive Davis had protege too. Now give me a minute because I want to find the name of his okay. So his mentor, meaning Clive Davis's mentor, was Goddard Lieberson, who at the time was the CBS director and senior vice president. And he had signed up before he turned the role over to Clive Davis, he had signed up Paul Simon, Art Garfunkel, Bob Dylan. People think Bob Dylan also is sort of like, I'm just going to leave that blank. And the Byrds. And gradually, under his leadership, rock began to represent more than half of Columbia's sales. And then Clive Davis was hired by Lieberson in 1965 and became president of the CBS Record Group in 1971. Uh, Lieberson basically stayed on as an officer and director of the parent company. But when Clive Davis got into some deep trouble in 1973, and I'm going to get into the deep trouble, so we do have time, and I will get into this. He took back his original position, meaning Davis's position. So, oh, I have to take a deep breath here. Um, I mean, I have a couple of notes. I mean, so Davis's demise, and we have to remember that he had a decline. He was fired. He was sued. He was never put in jail for anything. That should tell you something. But it was foreshadowed by the firing in April of 1973 by David Winshaw. And Winshaw was Columbia's director of artist relations. So basically, CBS executives state that Winshaw was padding bills from outside contractors and keeping the excess for himself. And the findings led CBS to examine his boss's expenses. Now, who was his boss? His boss happened to have been Clive Davis. And so the company filed a lawsuit, and it included Davis. And it said that Davis used company funds of $54,000 to redecorate his Manhattan apartment, $20,000 to throw a bar mitzvah for his son, and about $13,000 to rent a house. Now remember, this is 1970. This is like actually he began padding the his expenses, I guess, when he was put into the position. So we're talking the 60s, the early 70s, when these amounts of money were frankly, what, 5, 6 times their equivalent today. And again, the 13,000 was to rent a house last summer in Beverly Hills. And so at the time, he said, that if something came out 6 months later and CBS had done nothing, that quote, to cover it up would have been like a Watergate. However, what CBS did in actuality was to investigate itself and find itself not guilty, which is what Leon Black did with Apollo and what Wexy did with L Brands. They investigated themselves and they found themselves to be, oh, we did nothing wrong. However, I'm going to take you into at least one of the scathing articles, dated June 22nd, 1973, about CBS telling its own ugly story. So even there, they're letting you know that they're telling you their own story and they're leaving out portions of it. So they're telling you at least what they feel is safe, and what they feel is safe is frankly still scandalous, but they're leaving out other parts that we are now hearing about or that the public is hearing about. Let's say in the Sean Diddy Combs case, as it comes to human transportation and all of that stuff. So it begins. Has the agony of Watergate taught us nothing about how to handle scandal? The Columbia Broadcasting System, a corporation active in many businesses, earned 82 million last year. Its fastest growing center, which accounts for nearly 30% of its earnings, the division that produces CBS records and tapes. CBS is by far the largest producer of records and tapes in the youth-dominated music world, an industry that takes in revenues of $2 billion per year. Now, by 1973, the record industry was taking in 2 billion with a B every year. It shows you how big of an industry it was. So big that you cannot possibly let somebody, let's say, like Sean Diddy Combs or even Jay-Z, really be the heads of their own companies, right? So there has to be leadership over them, which is being missed by, I think, almost everyone who was reporting on these scandals as if they are standalone scandals, even though they do share the fact that Jay-Z has been dishonest by claiming that he was just an acquaintance of Sean Combs. There is so much more deviousness in this because it does have upper layers, again, connected to intelligence and to world affairs, because the intelligence services don't just do something for the mere, for one reason. They do not just do something to, let's say, make money. They do it to exert power elsewhere. So while most people may know that intelligence agencies are part of the, or maybe you, because I have never heard anybody else talk about this. And I am planning to go on a podcast that has a lot of followers uh, very soon. And I hope to be talking about this on a bigger platform so that more people can become apprised of what's really happening, as opposed to what's happening on the lower level. So, at the time, 2 billion was considered more money than all of the professional sports and the entire film industry combined. Grand juries, and I'm going to continue to read this article, grand juries and district attorneys are now trying to find out if the music industry is shot through with a higher dollar volume of venality and corruption than has ever been seen in American business history. The corporate corruption being investigated includes the old-fashioned payola, bribery to disc jockeys by record companies with a new ethnic wrinkle. One CBS Records executive has reportedly told a grand jury that $250,000 in cash has been slipped to disc jockeys who direct their programming, listen to this carefully, to Black audiences. So I have some additional information that I'm going to be sharing separately, perhaps only on my Patreon, regarding the Black civil rights leader Martin Luther King and how he was infiltrated and how it connects to my abuser's family. And yeah, I'm pausing here because sometimes I am triggered when I do this work and when I share things with you. So they were looking directly into how they were using it to, again, control what the Black audiences were listening to. So this did not begin with Sean Puffy Combs. It did not begin with Jay-Z. It began back in the 70s and perhaps earlier than that, in the 60s, controlling the Black populace. And the Black populace does not just limited to Blacks. We have other minorities grouped in with the Black populace because if you are not white, you are considered by the US government to be Black. Okay. So I'm going to go continue with the article. Oh, and I just lost the article. There's nothing that your friendly computer won't do when you're trying to share information. So let me see if I can just get back to, okay. So, but the return of payola, even on an unprecedented scale, is not the whole story. Federal investigators are looking into the use of hard drugs, the white and the brown. And thank you, I forget your name also, who told me that the H word is actually brown, by businessmen of music to bribe their distribution outlets or to entertain their entertainers. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Substances unearthed the first lead while investigating Pascual Falcone, a reputed New Jersey mobster indicted on DRUG charges on February 7th. Now that would be 1973. He turned out to be sharing an office with a former promotion man at Columbia Records, whose papers led to David Winshaw. Remember, Winshaw worked for Clive Davis. So these people are below Clive Davis, including Pascual Falcone. And we are going to find out who Falcone was in a minute. So Winshaw, until recently, was director of artist relations at CBS Records Group. Since that time, at least 3 official investigations have been launched into the use of white and brown and other substances as a form of new payola in the music industry, along with MAFIA infiltration of the music industry's distribution system. Beginning what may be the second most massive cover-up of the past 12 months, CBS fired its records division president, Clive Davis, charging him in a curious lawsuit with the world's equivalent of spitting on the sidewalk. Now, what they're trying to say in this very not well articulated paragraph is that instead of charging him with what he was supposed to have done, they minimized the lawsuit, sort of like the equivalent of him spitting on the sidewalk, which reminded me of how Epi said that what he had done was the equivalent of stealing a bagel. So Clive Davis, in his day, it was the equivalent of him spitting on the sidewalk. So we can tell immediately that Davis is a protected individual like Epi, and that he was, in fact, an asset of the three-letter agency. And that is how you find your assets. You find out who is whose crimes are not properly exposed, who is not taken to jail. And I'm not saying that Sean Combs is an exception because he's in jail, because we know Ghislaine Maxwell. Every now and then, some of these bottom, I'm going to call them bottom feeders for the purpose of this podcast, have to be eliminated. The cancer in this music business, and I'm going back to the article, is not in padded expense accounts. And the panic-stricken men who head CBS today know the cancer is what killed singers Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. The new currency of the record industry is, and they specifically use the DRUGS. So I give them credit for at least discussing the fact that it plays a very prominent role, but they do not talk about how it's transported or where they get it from. They just talk about the fact that it is a problem in the music industry. So it goes on to say, what action has CBS taken so far to build a defense against stockholder lawsuits? It has fired and sued Mr. Davis to give the appearance of self-investigation. It has asked its regular law firm, Kravitz, Swain, and Moore, to poke around, but the law firm is Roswell L. Kilpatrick, who also happens to be the best and brightest member of the board of directors of CBS. So again, we saw the same pattern when Leon Black had Apollo investigated and when Wexy had L. Brands investigated. We find that members of the board are in fact part of the investigation attorney team. And then the men at Block Rock, and by the way, the building that CBS was at the time was called Black Rock. There is no coincidence here. And I'm not going to delve into this right now. I'm just going to keep going. So instead of building legal barricades in bringing in old faces, CBS Chairman and Chief Executive Officer William Paley, and then honestly, the rest of this was so garbled that it's hard to figure out or make out heads or tails. And I find, as somebody who does go through old newspaper archives on a regular basis, that or even if you go into the CIA vault or you go into the FBI vault, there are some documents that, although they have been made public, they're so garbled and not just blacked out in certain places, but so garbled that you cannot make heads or tails out of it, and it's not a coincidence. So I'm going to end this part 2. Clive Davis clearly regained his position, and I'm sure he did it because of his standing with the three-letter agency, and what was not really discussed here was his relationship with Paley, And by the way, Paley's wife was Babe Paley, who we know through, oh God, there's just so many, because it just goes off into so many tangents. I'll leave this for another episode so that you can stay tuned. Meanwhile, please give this a like. I'm curious to read your comments. Have a good day, guys. Bye.